Well, welcome to another episode of the Vitamin D and Me podcast. We're absolutely delighted today to have such a leading authority, Dr. Michael Holick, professor of medicine, amongst other things, which he will explain at Boston University Medical Center. So, Dr. Holick, thank you so much for taking time to join us today. Really appreciate it.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
So, tell us a bit about yourself and your esteemed career as relates to vitamin D and otherwise.
Sure. So I'm a professor of medicine, physiology, biophysics, and molecular medicine, director of the Vitamin D Skin and Bone Research Laboratory, and director of the Ehlers-Danlos Clinical Research Program at Boston University Medical Center. I've been doing research in the field of vitamin D now since 1969. And I'm always asked, how did I get involved in this area? Did I really choose this area? And the answer is simply no. I had actually no interest in working in vitamin D, but as a graduate student entering into the biochemistry department, most of the really hot topics like in mitochondrial research, oxidation, and DNA was now being discovered. That's where I wanted to work, but they already had plenty of postdoctoral fellows and students. They didn't need another one. And so they sent me over to Dr. Hector DeLuca and said that, why don't you see him? He's working in the field of vitamin D. And my response was, why would I want to work in vitamin D? I couldn't think of a more boring subject. But it turns out that basically made a sow's ear into a golden purse, because for my master's degree, I was the one that identified 25-hydroxyvitamin D, which turns out to be the major circulating form of vitamin D in the circulation, used by doctors worldwide to determine a person's vitamin D status. I then went on and was the first in Dr. DeLuca's laboratory to isolate and identify the active form of vitamin D, 125-dihydroxyvitamin D, that's produced in your kidneys. And then it became clear patients with kidney disease had bone disease, and they had a resistance to vitamin D. Now that we realize that the active form of vitamin D is being produced by the kidneys, it was important to be able to chemically make it. It turns out that I have an organic chemistry background. I have a chemistry degree from Seton Hall University. And so my roommate and I spent almost 2 years developing a synthetic method to make the active form of vitamin D. And we did. We were the first to successfully do that. And it was used to treat metabolic bone disease in infants and children with rare genetic disorders, as well as patients with kidney disease that were wheelchair bound. And once they took what we had produced in the test tube to began walking again, it was my introduction into translational medicine, which really got me excited.
Mhm.
And then I asked a question, which is vitamin D is made in your skin from the sun. Now that intrigued me, because why would Mother Nature use sunlight as providing such an important nutrient? And so I then decided, after leaving the University of Wisconsin and doing a residency at the Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston, is to start up a vitamin D laboratory in the endocrine unit, headed by Dr. John T. Potts Jr. And I asked some questions. How do you make vitamin D in your skin when you're exposed to sunlight? What factors regulate it? Time of day, season, latitude, degree of skin pigmentation. So over the next decade, I spent most of my effort basically writing the book on the photobiology of vitamin D. And then I became intrigued by the fact that we know that the way active vitamin D works is it interacts with its receptor, the vitamin D receptor. And that's in your intestine and in your bone, regulates calcium metabolism. But it was curious that your skin cells had a vitamin D receptor, and I wanted to know why. And so we started growing skin cells in culture. We added the active form of vitamin D and found that it inhibited their proliferation and induced terminal differentiation. Well, that was intriguing. So I put my MD hat back on and asked the question, what skin diseases out there, hyperproliferative skin disease that's non-malignant, that turns out to afflict 2% of the world's population, that potentially you could use active vitamin D to treat? And the answer was psoriasis. So we initiated some of the first clinical trials demonstrating the topical application of the active form of vitamin D could be used to treat psoriasis. It's one of the first line treatments for patients with psoriasis, like on their elbows or on their knees, as a simple way of helping to resolve it. So that's how I got involved in the vitamin D business. And I've been involved in it ever since. And we continue to make new inroads in our understanding of the importance of vitamin D for overall health and welfare from birth until death.
Wow. And then in terms of the dosing and what you saw in the topical application versus the oral ingested dietary supplement model, what type of dosing ranges or regimen did you hone in on for patients or study participants that you saw?
Right. So remember, it's the active form of vitamin D. So 125 dihydroxy vitamin D is what we use to treat psoriasis, right? Mm. When you ingest vitamin D or make it in your skin, it goes to your liver, gets converted to 25 hydroxy vitamin D, and then it goes to your kidneys to get activated to 125 dihydroxy vitamin D. It also turns out, curiously, that when you increase your vitamin D intake, you will increase your blood levels of 25 hydroxy vitamin D, but you will not increase your blood levels of 125 dihydroxy vitamin D. And the reason is
I was going to say,
that
why
the
is that?
kidneys produce it to regulate calcium metabolism. It increases the efficiency of calcium absorption in your gut and removal of calcium from your bones if you're not getting enough from dietary sources. Well, if your kidneys started making more of it, you would be absorbing more and more calcium, and your blood calcium would go up. So the body very carefully regulates its production. However, there is a new piece to the story, which is that your colon, prostate, breast, brain, skin, and many other tissues and cells in your body, including your immune cells, activate vitamin D locally. And that's why we think it's so important to increase your blood levels of 25 hydroxy vitamin D by increasing your vitamin D intake in order for all of those activities to now occur.
And what have you seen clinically in terms of the oral dose, in terms of the, I guess it would be the vitamin D cholecalciferol form, the dietary form? What do you typically look for, see for the average consumer? I know everyone's a custom case, but for the average consumer, what do you typically discuss?
So there are two forms of vitamin D, as you're well aware, right? Vitamin D3 is made in your skin, found in cod liver oil, in oily fish like salmon. Those are the major sources. Also fortified in milk, orange juice, and some other food products in the United States. Vitamin D2 comes from the UV irradiation of yeast. That was the first form of vitamin D that was identified back in the 1930s, was used for food fortification up until recently. India has now begun fortifying both milk and cooking oil with vitamin D2, because vitamin D2 is not coming from an animal source like vitamin D3. And so both vitamin D2 and vitamin D3 are equally metabolized by the body and utilized basically in a similar fashion. So how much vitamin D do you need, and what is its impact? So we did a study. The first study that we did and published back in 2013, we asked a simple question. We know that vitamin D, by raising your blood levels of 25 hydroxy vitamin D, plays an important role in immune function. And we know that your macrophages, kind of like the packed men and women in your blood that gobble up infectious processes, they activate vitamin D. And the reason they activate vitamin D is to be able to increase production of proteins that will kill infectious agents. And we think it also activates vitamin D and releases it locally to regulate immune function in both T and B lymphocytes, regulating antibody production, reducing risk for autoantibody productions, reducing risk of autoimmune disorders, and regulating cytokine production in T cells to help modulate immune responsiveness. So we did a simple study, and we took 8 healthy adults, and we gave them 2,000 units of vitamin D a day during the wintertime. They were vitamin D deficient or insufficient. We got their white blood cells from their bloodstream, and we looked at gene expression at baseline and 3 months later. And we showed that we were able to up and down regulate several hundred genes, controlling more than 80 different metabolic processes. We then did a follow-up study and asked the question, can you continue to increase your vitamin D intake, and what is its impact on immune function? So we took healthy vitamin D deficient and insufficient adults and gave them either 600 units of vitamin D a day, the amount recommended by the Institute of Medicine for all adults, 4,000 units of vitamin D a day, which is the upper limit recommended by the Institute of Medicine, and 10,000 units a day as recommended as the upper limit by the Endocrine Society practice guidelines. And just for people to be aware, I was fortunate to chair that committee, and all the members on that committee were experts in the field of vitamin D, and we came out with recommendations. So what did we find? We made 2 important observations. The first question to be asked is, we know that improving your vitamin D status will help regulate calcium metabolism. And the question is, can you dissociate the vitamin D effect on calcium metabolism from all of these immune responses and other activities? And we showed very nicely that those that took 600 units a day really didn't change what's called parathyroid hormone levels. That's what is coming from the parathyroid glands in your neck that helps to regulate calcium metabolism. 4,000 units a day helped to bring down the PTH level into a nice range. On 10,000 units a day, there was no significant difference. So we could show very nicely that on 4,000 units a day, it seemed to have maximum benefit for calcium metabolism. And then we looked at gene expression in these white blood cells, the immune cells in your bloodstream. On 600 units a day, a little over 150 genes were up and down regulated. So even taking a small amount of vitamin D had an effect on your immune system. 4,000 units a day, over 300 genes. And on 10,000 units a day, over 1,200 genes were up and down regulated just by increasing the vitamin D intake up to 10,000 units a day. We also, of course, looked at our blood levels of 25-hydroxy vitamin D, right? And so on 600 units a day, basically didn't change. On 4,000 units a day, it went into that preferred range as recommended by the Endocrine Society of 40 to 60 nanograms per ml. On 10,000 units a day, it was now in the range of 60 up to 90 nanograms per ml, and there was no toxicity.
Excellent. No, great synopsis. When you talk about calcium or regulating calcium metabolism specifically, for the average consumer out there, member of the public, one gets mixed messages often, or perceived mixed messages around things like calcium intake, or very plain English, eggs are good for you, eggs are bad for you. So one talks about getting enough calcium, but then vitamin D has a role in regulating calcium metabolism. Unpack that confusion for us a little bit further. I think that'd be very helpful.
Sure. So the Institute of Medicine has recommended that that for teenagers, that 1,300 milligrams of calcium a day, and for adults, 1,000 milligrams a day, and those over the age of 50, probably 1,200 milligrams of calcium a day. My preference is dietary sources coming from either plant-based diet or dairy. There's 300 milligrams in 8 ounces of skim milk, and it contains a good source of protein, whey protein, which contains all the essential amino acids. And so I usually recommend to my patients 3 servings of dairy a day as about 900 to 1,000 milligrams of dietary calcium. But if you're unable to have dairy because of lactose intolerance, you can always use lactate milk. Orange juice, many orange juices are now fortified with calcium. So I tell my patients, you could switch one of your glasses of orange juice in the morning to calcium fortified, which also contains vitamin D, are all good sources. But if you can't do that, then think about taking a calcium supplement. And my recommendation is make it simple. And so often Tums, which is chewable, is a great source of calcium. The fact that you chew it automatically means it's going to be bioavailable. Because if you take that piece of chalk, that calcium carbonate pill, if you can't make stomach acid or you're on medications that prevent you from making stomach acid, the pill goes in one end and going out the other. But if you chew it, it's bioavailable. So I tell my patients, Tums, and there's a Tums 500, which is 500 milligrams, to take one twice a day if they're unable to get it from other dietary sources.
And why is regulating calcium metabolism important? That vitamin D serves that function in the body.
Right. So typically, if you're vitamin D deficient, you only absorb about 10 to 15% of your dietary calcium. Now, why is that important? Because you're constantly losing at least 100 up to 300 milligrams of calcium every day in your urine. And you need to replace that. You lose about 200 milligrams in gastrointestinal juices. So you're already starting out after 24 hours of losing somewhere in the range of 300 to 500 milligrams of calcium. So if you're not absorbing enough calcium from your diet, because your body cares about your blood calcium and will maintain it at any expense, it will take it out of your skeleton. And so having adequate amount is important. When you're vitamin D sufficient, you absorb 30 to 40% of your dietary calcium. During pregnancy, lactation, and growth spurt, the body increases the production of active vitamin D going to the intestine. So now you can improve intestinal calcium absorption by 60 to 80%.
Wow. And then in terms of vitamin D intake, how does that work with maternal transfer and lactation and breastfeeding moms? How does vitamin D work in that capacity?
So we think that this is incredibly important. We had done a study many years ago with Lisa Bodner in Pittsburgh and a more recent study showing that during pregnancy, that it's important for pregnant women to be vitamin D sufficient because vitamin D deficiency increases risk of preeclampsia, requiring the need for cesarean sectioning, and also is associated with premature births. So vitamin D is very important during pregnancy. The amount of vitamin D that mom is taking, her blood level of 25-hydroxy vitamin D is transferred to the developing fetus. And so the fetal blood will be essentially the same as mom's at the time mom gives birth. Why is that important? Because the Institute of Medicine has recommended that all adults, including pregnant women, be on 600 units a day. So we did a study and showed in 40 mother-infant pairs at our hospital that we documented was taking 600 units of vitamin D a day. 76% of moms and 81% of newborns were vitamin D deficient. Now, what about lactation? Curiously, human breast milk essentially contains no vitamin D. Now, of course, if you think about that from an evolution perspective, that makes no sense, right? And so it turns out that it isn't that human breast milk can't contain an adequate amount of vitamin D. It's because we're not taking enough vitamin D. Our hunter-gatherers outside every day were making thousands of units of vitamin D a day. A study done in Maasai herders and Hadza Bushmen showed their blood levels on average are 40 to 60 nanograms per ml for 25-hydroxy vitamin D. How do you get there? You would need to be ingesting 4,000 to 5,000 units of vitamin D a day. And so now go back to the study done by Bruce Hollis and Carol Wagner. And they showed that if you give lactating women about 6,400 units of vitamin D a day. They put enough vitamin D in their milk to satisfy their infant's requirement. So in my opinion, this is teaching us from an evolution perspective how much vitamin D we all need, that it isn't 600 units a day or even 1,000 units a day, but more like several thousand units a day. I typically have most of my patients on at least 3 up to 5,000 units of vitamin D a day. I personally take 6,000 units a day, and my blood level is in the range of about, for 25-hydroxy-D, 72 nanograms per ml.
Very good. No, very interesting, fascinating information. And then we talk about the hunter-gatherer time frame and people taking vitamin D in through sunlight naturally. How does that process work? Because it sounds like a great way to get a very inexpensive vitamin D.
So herein lies the problem. That's what everybody thinks, that you could just go out and get a little bit of sunlight. No, our hunter-gatherers were out there, right, from the time the sun rose to the time the sun set, right, at least half naked, right? So we did a study and showed that if you expose your entire body to an amount of sunlight equivalent to a minimal erythemal dose, so a light pinkness to your skin 24 hours later, it's equivalent to ingesting about 15,000 to 20,000 units of vitamin D. That's whole body. Okay. Well, think about it. You're clothed, right? So maybe you're exposing your face and your hands and maybe your arms in short sleeve shirts and maybe your legs. But again, think about it. You're not lying down straight and getting sun exposure directly, right? It's more of an angle. And so it's very difficult, unless you're a lifeguard, to get enough vitamin D from sun exposure. And that's why, in my opinion, dietary sources help a little bit, but it's really supplements that are probably necessary because of our lifestyle.
Very interesting. And then in the current age we're in of COVID, obviously, what is some of the current research on vitamin D relating to immune health, immune response, and overall wellness for the individual?
Yeah, and so just an FYI, I helped to develop an app because I'm always asked the question: time of day, season, latitude, degree of skin pigmentation, how long do I stay outside? How much vitamin D can I make? And so working with Ontometrics, a California group, we developed an app, DMinder, DMinder.info. It's free on your Android and iPhone. It'll tell you anywhere on the globe when you could begin making vitamin D, how much vitamin D you make based on your skin type, time of day, season, latitude, altitude, doesn't matter. Followed by, we tell you to get out of the sun so you don't get a sunburn.
Very good. Sounds like a very worthwhile app.
Yeah. So vitamin D and COVID. So we had done a study with Quest Diagnostics, which is a reference lab that does millions of blood tests in a relatively short period of time. And so working with them, asked the question, if you look at COVID infectivity and relate it to vitamin D status, the blood level of 25-hydroxy vitamin D, is there any relationship? And so we looked at over 191,000 blood samples throughout all 50 states, including all ages, all ethnicities, and latitude, and showed that if you have a blood level of 25-hydroxy vitamin D of 20 or less, compared to 34 nanograms per ml, reduced risk of COVID infectivity by 54%. And if you continued to have increased levels of 25-hydroxy vitamin D, it actually improved even further, out to 60 nanograms per ml. So that was the first observation that we made. The second observation was that we asked the question, if we look at COVID patients coming into a hospital setting, this is in Iran, working with Dr. Magabouli and Dr. Shervani, asking the question, 74% of over 200 patients with serious COVID infection, we related their blood levels of 25-hydroxy vitamin D and demonstrated a significant reduced risk of morbidity and mortality. In fact, for those over the age of 40, more than 50% reduced of dying simply by being vitamin D sufficient at the time they entered the hospital. And we now have good evidence that vitamin D, through its activation in macrophages and interacting with the receptor in T and B lymphocytes, is probably modulating cytokine production in a way to minimize cytokine storm, which is one of the major complications and major cause of morbidity and mortality associated with this viral infection. So we think that vitamin D has a very critical role to play. Study done in Israel has basically made the same observation. And there's a study in Spain who actually gave 25-hydroxy vitamin D, which is a supplement available in Spain, and showed that there's reduced risk for morbidity and mortality. So there's a large database now to suggest that improvement in vitamin D status can help us in this pandemic.
Very, very fascinating. And then in terms of the research going forward, or what are you've obviously been at this for a while and you're a leading authority, like we mentioned earlier. Where do you see the research going? What are the next big areas that you feel discovery will occur in vitamin D research?
Well, I think one of them might be, because we had just also made an interesting observation, which is 25-hydroxy vitamin D3, right, the major circulating form, turns out was available back in the 1970s in the United States as a pharmaceutical to treat vitamin D deficiency. But the thinking at the time was that it's expensive and you can simply take vitamin D, so why have a prescription? So we did a recent study, and we did a pharmacokinetic study asking two questions. Because 25-hydroxy vitamin D has an extra hydroxyl group on it, which means it's more water soluble, we thought that it's likely that when you ingest it, that it gets directly absorbed from your intestine into the bloodstream that goes right to the liver. Normally, when you ingest vitamin D, it's fat soluble. So it actually has to form what are called these micelles, chylomicrons, that go into your lymphatic system, that then go into the superior vena cava, into your circulation. So patients that have fat malabsorption syndromes, like Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, right, inflammatory bowel disease, we had shown many years ago with a vitamin D absorption test, they can't efficiently absorb it. Also, patients with gastric bypass surgery bypass the area in the intestine where you make those chylomicrons. And so they have a very difficult time correcting their vitamin D deficiency. And so we did a study and gave patients with various types of inflammatory bowel disease and gastric bypass surgery of vitamin D, 900 micrograms, or 25-hydroxy vitamin D3, again, 900 micrograms. And we did a crossover study. So we did it in the same individual. So we gave vitamin D, and then 2 weeks later gave 25-hydroxy vitamin D, or vice versa. And what we found was that those that took the vitamin D could only absorb about 40 to 50%. But those that took 25-hydroxy vitamin D3 were much more efficient and could absorb it much more readily. We then asked another question. Obesity. We know that obese people need 2 to 3 times more vitamin D to satisfy their requirement, because we think that the vitamin D gets diluted in the body fat. And so we gave obese patients the same study and showed that obese patients raised their blood levels much more efficiently when they took calcifediol, the 25-hydroxy vitamin D3. It's now available as a supplement in Australia, available in Spain, and I think hopefully in the near future will become available maybe even in the United States. So I think that is going to be a very helpful. We're doing a study right now that we're in the process of publishing, showing that if you give 25-hydroxyvitamin D3, that maybe you could see an improvement in COVID outcomes. And a study done in Spain demonstrated this. So there's a lot of good evidence about this. The second is that I think we need to be appreciative that vitamin D, in my opinion, is not a treatment, right? You really need to maintain your vitamin D status, healthy vitamin D status from birth until death. And we really need better fortification programs. More foods need to be fortified with vitamin D. And we really need to get the message out because we think that the amount of burden on costs for healthcare is enormous. I mean, vitamin D deficiency has been associated with autoimmune disorders like type 1 diabetes, multiple sclerosis, rheumatoid arthritis, increased risk for type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, Alzheimer's disease, depression, neurocognitive dysfunction. And most recently, they even showed if you're vitamin D deficient, you're more drug seeking, and that maybe being vitamin D sufficient improves your mood, feel better, less likely to be addicted to narcotics.
Well, that's an exciting area and a potential exciting study as well.
Yep.
That would be very interesting and intriguing. So from the standpoint of some of the diagnostics, because you talked a bit about your app, and you also talked about having discovered ways in which to test this over the years and how it's gone out internationally. What do you think of some of the point of care devices and some of the self-testing that's starting to emerge technologically in terms of vitamin D?
I think that they have that blood spot test that then send off to the laboratory that they then do liquid chromatography tandem mass spectroscopy on, which is fine. It's a good test. But some of these home tests, I get a lot of emails all the time, and I have a blog, right? And they're telling me that they have a blood level of 15 and they're taking vitamin D, and they don't understand it because they're doing this in-home testing. So my advice was, get your doctor to get it and send it off, and they find that, in fact, their vitamin D is sufficient. So I think we need to be cautious about these in-home devices for measuring vitamin D status.
How long does it take to build up? What if a naive user comes in, starts learning about vitamin D from wherever, and says, "Okay, I'm going to take the 2 to 3,000, 3,000 to 4,000 IUs per day. I'm overweight. I want to do something about that, so I'm going to take even more." How long does it take till it hits a steady state where you're in that optimal zone typically?
So we've done the studies, and others have as well. And it turns out, interesting about vitamin D, when you are on a dose of vitamin D, you raise your blood level to a certain degree and then it stays there. And it takes 6 to 8 weeks when you increase your vitamin D intake. And so, for example, on 1,000 units a day, you will raise your blood level by about 10, from about 20 to 30 nanograms per ml. On 2,000 units a day, you'll raise it by about 15 to 20, and therefore it'll go to 35 to 40 nanograms per ml. If you're on 5,000 units a day, you'll raise it about 40 to 50, and now you're at around 50 to 80 nanograms per ml. And so the blood level goes up and it gets there at around 6 to 8 weeks and basically stays there. And so being on 3,000 units a day will not build up in your body fat, will not cause toxicity.
Very interesting. Well,
just a caveat,
yes.
Okay, which is that if you have a chronic granulomatous disorder like sarcoidosis or tuberculosis in some parts of the world, the activated macrophages will activate vitamin D. So you have to be very careful about how much vitamin D you take in, and therefore you need to consult a physician about this. There's also a rare disorder called a 24-hydroxylase deficiency that can also cause high blood calcium. So there are certain diseases and disorders that you have to be careful about. But for the most part, for the usual run-of-the-mill patient, it's not an issue.
Got it. Well, this has been fascinating. Dr. Holick, I can't thank you enough for sharing your expertise and just so wealth of information across so many across the entire spectrum of of vitamin D and health. So thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciate it. And thank you for sharing so much information in a user-friendly way. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Have a delightful day, and do send me the link.
Will do.